joining us for this WorkSource Georgia Academy training session on subrecipient monitoring. Thank you also to everyone who filled out the survey regarding your local area's process for conducting monitoring. That greatly helped to inform the material that we will be presenting today. So our goal with this training is to focus on the requirements and best practices for subrecipient monitoring. And we want this to help provide you all with some options for creating a more formalized subrecipient monitoring process in your local area. We are also looking into options to create a follow-up training to this that will potentially be more of a hands-on training, whether that be assisting you all in building out your monitoring tools or crafting subrecipient monitoring policies. We will, of course, keep everyone posted on that and how and when it will be offered. So before we get into our material for today, I'd like to do some brief introductions of the Office of Workforce Development team. My name is Brittany Singer. I'm the Compliance Director. We also have Serena Walker, the Grants Director, and then Cherie Olivis, who is the Programs Manager. So our three teams are responsible for conducting the state's monitoring of local areas, and we created this presentation to try and cover all of our disciplines. You'll hear more from these folks later, but we also have Dayon Woods and Karen Abram from the Compliance team. We have Marcos Pope, Scott Levitt, and Renee Robinson from the Finance team, as well as Andrea Stevens from the Programs team. So thank you to everyone for being here today and pulling this information together. And without further ado, we'll get into our material here. We have our agenda. We'll just do a quick overview of the subrecipient monitoring requirements. We'll talk about policies, the process, and then we'll get into the different subject matter areas, and each of the teams will present on those all. The first slide that we have here has some helpful links. So as we go through this training, we're going to be referencing various federal regulations as well as our state policy. So the links that you see here are to the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations and then to our state website that hosts our state policy manual. Why do we conduct subrecipient monitoring? Obviously, the simple answer to this question is that it is a requirement for all recipients and subrecipients under WA. The law requires that these entities conduct regular oversight and monitoring to ensure compliance. And this process helps to ensure that proper systems are in place, that they're being followed, and that they, of course, meet the requirements of federal, state, and local law and policies to reduce the possibility of audit exceptions, sanctions, or unallowable costs. Through the use of an established monitoring procedure, we can minimize risk or other issues, and hopefully through early detection and correction. So a robust monitoring process is going to help to identify those areas of concern, and it will provide you all with an opportunity to correct program design, various policy deficiencies, and to just identify better ways of doing business. So in addition to the requirement to monitor, these activities should also carry over into the technical assistance that you provide to your subrecipients. Now, this of course does not mean that you are providing technical assistance during the monitoring visit. For those issues that have been identified, those require documentation and corrective actions. But as a follow-up, since you've identified weak areas, you may then want to develop further training to ensure that those issues do not persist. That's actually how our office gets many of our ideas for technical assistance trainings and guidance. In addition to the topics that are listed by local areas, when we're out in the field monitoring, we may encounter certain situations that either raise a red flag and require additional training to correct the issue, or it brings to light a process of which we were not necessarily aware, or unique situations that a policy might not have anticipated. So of course, even the best written policy can run into issues in implementation, and you may not know about it until you monitor and evaluate. I've heard it said that strategic planning is useless unless you implement and evaluate it, and I think that rings true here. We can plan for how it will roll out or how an internal procedure is going to work, but until we see how it works in practice and evaluate its success, that plan may not actually meet the needs. So monitoring allows us to do this and take a look at our processes and procedures. And of course, it is first and foremost a way to ensure compliance and meet the requirements of the law, but it can be so much more than that if you build out a robust process. Who is responsible for monitoring? Recipients and subrecipients of funds under Title I of WIOA and under Wagner-Peiser are required to conduct regular oversight and monitoring. For this piece, I want to just generally discuss the responsibilities of the state, of local areas, and then of those subrecipients being monitored. So from the state's perspective, we at OWD are responsible for the development of the state's monitoring system. One of the attachments to this training is the comprehensive guide to monitoring that our office has created, which is our internal procedure document for conducting monitoring. Just so you all are aware, this document is updated as of the PY18 monitoring, and it is due for revision soon. But we wanted to include it just so you have a general idea of how we have created the process, and we're going to discuss that process more in detail later on. We're also going to dig in a little deeper on the process to provide some ideas for implementing something similar at the local level. But just generally, again, from the perspective, we review local area policies and procedures. We conduct interviews of various levels of staff to discern how those policies and procedures are being communicated, down from the board to frontline staff. And then we also review board operations, obviously financial documentation and contracts, in addition to reviewing participant eligibility and case files. Of course, the state has the responsibility to monitor local areas and to set further guidance for you all to conduct your own subrecipient monitoring. Now, the state has not necessarily set any process requirements for how local areas are to conduct subrecipient monitoring, which is part of the reason why we're holding this training today. The requirements we've passed down onto you are more about the content of what you're looking at for your subs. So there are a variety of processes around the state that local areas use with varying degrees of formality. And our role on top of actually monitoring our subrecipients is to make sure that those local processes accomplish similar goals of ensuring accountability of the system and appropriate use of WIOA funds. So again, that's kind of why we put this training together today, to just help show you what our process looks like and maybe some pieces that you all could adopt to use in monitoring your own subrecipients. And on that note, local areas, of course, have that same responsibility to monitor subrecipients of Title I WIOA funds. So when you create a subaward, you're not handing over that responsibility for those funds. The funding can get passed through multiple levels between the federal government and the entity that's actually administering the services and required activities. That requirement to monitor ensures that the accountability doesn't get diluted along the way. So if appropriate checks are in place, then again, those issues can be corrected early and hopefully before the state even comes in to conduct our annual monitoring. Even if you pass those on to a subrecipient, it's still your responsibility at the end of the day. So, local areas, of course, should be into the activities of their subrecipients in order to build out a process that is adequately going to review those policies and procedures that they're implementing. Simple surface level reviews, for example, a simple interview or just spot checks of documentation are certainly encouraged throughout the year, but the actual monitoring should consist of much more than that. This should be a task to simply check off for the year, but it should be something that serves as a quality assurance check in addition to verifying compliance. So the other who that I want to discuss here is the entity actually being monitored. And I wanted to take a minute to discuss the difference between subrecipients, contractors, and vendors. Of course, those terms are used quite frequently in our world, but it never hurts to have a quick refresher on what each of those are. So on this slide, you'll see we've provided the citation here for where these definitions come from. And the definitions I'm about to discuss with you all are directly from that federal reg. But a subrecipient receives a subaward for the purpose of carrying out a portion of a federal award and creates a federal assistance relationship with the subrecipient. Whereas a contractor receives a contract for the purpose of obtaining goods and services for the non-federal entity's own use and creates a procurement relationship. As it relates to contractors and vendors, we really use those terms interchangeably, and it's more important to distinguish between a subrecipient and a contractor. And when you're doing that, the substance of the agreement is much more important than necessarily the form of the agreement. And the most important thing, here is to remember that as it pertains to our training topic, only subrecipients are required to be monitored. Of course, contractors are still going to be subject to the terms of the agreement, but they are not subject to the compliance requirements of the federal program. As far as their role in the subrecipient monitoring process, obviously those subrecipients are beholden to your process at the local level. when they take on that subaward, they should be made aware of the process and expectations as a result of administering these funds. They should be receptive to your request for documentation and information, and just helping you to ensure that the process runs smoothly and that lines of communication are open between the local area and the subrecipient. The final thing in terms of requirements here, just generally in our overview of subrecipient monitoring, is when must monitoring occur? So per the federal regulations, monitoring needs to occur at least annually. Now, this is an area where you can get creative in how you structure monitoring to be in line with your local area's structure, staffing capacity, and schedule. Because oversight is our main responsibility at the state level, we do all of our reviews at one time and send out a team to review and create a comprehensive report of all financial, programmatic, and other compliance topics. However, your local area may structure it slightly differently. Monitoring obviously takes time to plan for and review all of the applicable documentation and contracts and interview staff. So some areas may break it down into smaller reviews throughout the year. For example, you may group together the financial portion on a certain schedule and the programmatic review may be done separately, either because you don't have the time to execute them all at once or because you have separate staff that are doing those reviews. So again, it's up to your local area of how you structure this. As long as the process is set to ensure that all the required monitoring occurs annually, that is satisfactory to OWD. Each of our teams does check for subrecipient monitoring policies and procedures and verifies that those checks occurred. So if you don't do it all in one fell swoop, again, that's fine. It's more important that each area set up a process that works for them and allows for a quality review rather than that the process mirror exactly what the state does. So we will move along here to subrecipient monitoring policies. And so I want to talk about creating those policies and then also using them. Now I'll digress just slightly to say that generally I prefer to keep policies fairly high level and then create an internal procedure to accompany that policy. But that's going to sort of depend on how your local area handles it. Some areas may have a dedicated policy shop that do it one way. Others may create policies based on your subject matter area. That, again, is going to depend on what your local board prefers to see in your policies. Policies can serve more as the guiding principles, whereas a procedure lays out the operational process. So I'll use the state's monitoring policy as an example. So section 1.4 of the state policy manual lays out very generally what our monitoring and technical assistance process looks like. It hits the high points of the process, of the schedule and timeline, and then just generally discusses the topics that will be evaluated. However, in addition to that, we also then have our comprehensive guide to monitoring that accompanies the policy. So that guide provides a much more detailed explanation of how the schedule is developed, how risk assessments are created and used, and then goes into exactly what topics will be tested. So it lays out the protocol for monitoring and details the exact steps to be taken, which this allows us to conduct a uniform review of local areas, which is not only fair to the areas, but also allows for us to really dig in on those important topics. So again, having a set protocol allows for much more detailed reviews. When it comes to actually creating the monitoring policies and procedures, it's best to start by including the minimum requirements per federal regulations, and then looking at the policy regarding what must be evaluated in your subrecipient monitoring, and of course the frequency of monitoring, and then including any other additional local requirements that have been established by your local board. But then of course your internal procedures can provide much more detail and instructions to your staff for how that process will run. So on this slide you'll also see the citations for some of the applicable portions of the federal regulations. So our testing tools go into detail about the required aspects of subrecipient monitoring, policies, procedures, and plans, and those are provided to local areas every year at the start of our monitoring. So that would be another place that I would recommend you look when building out your tools for what to look for. So that's a great place to start. Of course, this list of citations here is not exhaustive, but again, it's a good place to start. So the final piece that I'm going to cover before I hand it off is how to build out your monitoring tools. Now, because we switched this training to a virtual platform, our initial idea of allowing time to assist you all in creating new tools or building out your existing tools was not necessarily feasible. However, like I said before, we are exploring options to still provide that type of hands-on training. So we will welcome any additional feedback that you might have about your needs or how we can assist as it relates to developing the monitoring tools. But to continue on here, monitoring tools can come in a variety of formats. So you could have detailed checklists, or like the state uses an Excel spreadsheet. But developing them involves pretty much the same process regardless of how they look. So our tools, again, like I said, are Excel, and ours were originally developed by KPMG when we transitioned from WIA to WIOA. We have, of course, updated them every year to include any changes in, guidance or our state policy. But I will say that our tools are pretty formal compared to some that I have seen used in the local areas. And again, your tools don't necessarily need to look like ours, but they should contain similar information. So of course, in these tools, you're going to have the questions that you're testing against, saying, does the subrecipient have X policy? Does the participant case file contain ABC documentation? But it's also important to know where the requirement comes from. So if you're going to cite a subrecipient for failure to meet a requirement, then it should be documented what federal, state, or local provision they are violating. And having these tools ready to go with that information already in them, one, makes the testing process just run smoother and, helps to inform exactly why you are looking for a specific document or piece of information. But two, it also makes the reporting piece easier as well. That way, once your review is complete, all of the information is essentially in one spot for you to be able to communicate it in a formal report or a formal meeting, anything like that, to the subrecipient to impose those corrective actions. And then also to be able to present it to your local board, showing what issues that you're running into. So, it just kind of allows for easy development of those reports and makes it easier for you to have all that information in one place, both for your own purpose, but then also when we come and monitor you to say, hey, yes, we did these checks, here are our tools. So that concludes my piece. We're going to move into discussing the monitoring process, and I will hand it over to Dayon Woods.
Thank you, Brittany. Throughout this portion of the presentation, we will do an overview of what a monitoring schedule should be, preparation for on-site monitoring, what to do during on-site monitoring, and what post-monitoring includes. The top picture shows the categories that OWD uses to keep track of their monitoring schedule. Below it is a proposed monitoring schedule for the locals based on the categories that the state uses. At minimum, the LWDA should have a column for their subrecipients, an actual date the monitoring visit should occur, and a closeout date. But if you would like to go the extra step, you can include the on-site end date if your monitoring visit is more than a day, and dates the subrecipient have to respond to your NFR or final report. These additional dates are used to help you not only keep track of what is going on, but also help you stick to a time frame. During your pre-monitoring stage, you should be reviewing your risk assessment to determine not only your sample size selection, but also use it to help determine any potential fraud risk. If your subrecipient expends $750,000 or more during the non-federal entity's fiscal year, and the federal awards must have a single or program-specific audit conducted for that year. You want to review any reports issued and confirm that any findings presented are resolved. OWD sends out a document request weeks prior to their site visit. Those documents are reviewed prior to getting on site to prepare for any follow-up questions that may result in further testing. OWD will also take this time to review and select samples, as well as host a pre-planning meeting with the compliance, finance, and programmatic teams. If the LWDA chooses to, a pre-monitoring phase can help prepare for the upcoming site visit, such as reviewing policies and procedures that the subrecipient is following to make sure it's in compliance. During the actual on-site visit, OWD starts off with an entrance conference. The LWDA should also at least start off with an introduction, announcing your presence and meeting the partners that will further assist you during your on-site visit. In a later presentation, you will get to see actual testing materials that the state uses to monitor their subrecipients. That topic will also inform the LWDA's which categories are relevant to their subs. Finally, OWD will provide an NFR and close out the visit with an exit conference. As an LWDA, a final report may be presented instead of an NFR, indicating the findings and observations observed while on site. As mentioned previously, the LWDA may provide the final report at the close of their monitoring visit instead of afterwards like OWD. If necessary, a corrective action period starts to allow the subrecipient to resolve any findings that were acknowledged during testing. A findings resolution is the entity's response to their sub's corrective action. During this time, technical assistance may also be provided when needed. Once all findings have been resolved, you will close out that monitoring visit and later report your results with your board. I will now turn it over to Serena Walker.
Hello, and thank you, Dayan. I will now review some best practices that we have observed in our monitoring experiences. Keep in mind that while the monitoring process itself may be familiar to you as a grantee, your lens or perspective must be different as you assume the role of grantor or pass-through entity. Monitoring tools should reflect federal, state, and local requirements. Think about what must be present in order to be in compliance. While each grantor or pass-through entity will have its own approach to monitoring, there are some things that are commonly best practices to keep in mind. For example, monitoring tools should always provide your grantee a clear indication of whether a finding is warranted. In preparation for your visit, review monitoring tools with your grantees. This is an important part of technical assistance. Subrecipients should always be clear on what is required and what you expect to see from them during the visit. Remember to update your tools regularly and communicate any changes to subrecipients. The monitoring tools should change as statute or policy changes. They should always reflect the law. For the integrity of the monitoring process, do not commingle technical assistance with monitoring. It is important that these two be kept separate. Also, document every detail, pre-monitoring, during the monitoring visit, and post-monitoring. Details may be forgotten if not recorded. Your review process should have a timeline that is clear to everyone. Will your grantee know when and how to communicate with you? It is important to establish this prior to your visit. Distinguish a finding from a recommendation. Remember, you are holding your grantee responsible to the law, not to your preferred way to manage or organize your operations. However, if it is a clear violation of law or policy, it must be a finding. If a finding is necessary, make it clear what occurred, when and how often, and what should be recorded for the record. Let's think about corrective actions. How will the grantee correct a violation if there is one? What evidence or supporting documentation is acceptable to you? This will likely vary based on the finding and must require some use of judgment and perspective. Like all monitoring components, it is important to establish expectations for corrective action prior to the visit. We would encourage you to periodically review your monitoring process, your outcomes, and your areas for follow-up. Monitoring results may reveal areas for potential technical assistance between you and your grantees.